Hi guys, how are you? Welcome back to this channel. My name is Laura from PleiadianHealer.com, and today we're going to talk about 4th of July. What are they really covering up, and why Independence Day makes no sense. So this is going to be for my US Americans, but it may also be of interest for other countries and nations, as you'll see in a second. And I'm going to share my screen with you guys. We're going to go through some notes. So people who have been following my channel for the past few years already, especially the old channel, you guys know I had this video out, and that was last year, exactly around the same time, by the way. And I had this beautiful thumbnail holding the American flag. I have an actual American flag right now, which is pretty neat too. Hope it's going to record in the right way, not like in a reverse camera reverse way. But yeah, so basically this is going to be a bit of a summary of that video because it turned out a bit long and with a few facts here and there that might have not been interesting for a few people. And I want to condense that information and add new information to it. So let's just start off with the basics. Why is it interesting for other nations and countries? Because this video is going to show how they are messing with the history in this country. And that also means most likely they're doing that in other countries. For example, the country you are currently in, just in a different way and on a different scale. Just look at the entire World War history, either war, by the way, World War I and World War II, and how it was just completely rewritten in favor of the victors. That's a great example in that case. The US is also a world power. Depending on which statistic you go by, it's either going to be the first country or among the first three, and is also one of the richest countries in the world. Once again, depends on which statistic you go by. Some people say it is the richest country in the world. Others say it's among the first 3 or 5. So it just really depends. I want to start off with the dates. So right off the bat, we are given 4 different dates. There are a few other dates, like some dates in June in between too. But the 4 major dates for Independence Day are July 2nd, July 4th, which ended up being the day they chose, August 2nd, which was the day the Declaration of Independence was fully signed by all 56 members of the committee, the Continental Congress, the Founding Fathers, and you have July 8th in between that, which was the day the Liberty Bell rang, which we'll look at the Liberty Bell too, why it has a crack in it and all of that. Okay, so what is interesting is that 4th of July was not even recognized on a federal level until the 1870s, and it did not become a paid holiday for federal workers and employees until 1941. That's almost 200 years after 1776. How come, if supposedly this is the most important holiday of the year in this country, or at least one of the most important ones, what happened in between 1776 and 1941? That's a question that's raised. We did have the mud floods in between, and the entire erasing history, Tartarian history, all of that lies in between 1776 and the late 1800s, where we had all of these world fairs, world expos. For example, the one in Chicago, you also had a few here in New York. So it does raise a question if perhaps with reshaping our entire history, this Independence Day became more and more prominent for a certain reason, and why that happened. And so with the federal one, I mean, if you're a federal worker, you didn't even get that day off, or you didn't get a paid holiday off, which is equally important until the 1900s, like 1938 to 1941 was when it was first implemented. That's a pretty big deal. The days suggested, meaning July 2nd, July 4th, July 8th, and August 2nd, all have a different type of numerology, which is also important. Because the numerology kind of has to do with the energy that it projects, the energy of the land we're in, how it kind of works together. And we'll go through the numerology one by one later on in this video. What I do have to say is July 2nd actually has a more favorable numerology. It's a better number than the 4th of July. July in and of itself is the month of sovereignty. 3 major countries celebrate their Independence Day. The first one, obviously, is the US, the most well-known one. Then you have France, which is the 14th, July 14th. That was Bastille Day, which, if I'm not mistaken, was also around a similar time, like in the 1700s or around that time. So all of these holidays, they're all mushed up together in the same era and period. And then you have Canada with July 1st. Denmark is a country that also celebrates 4th of July, the American 4th of July, in their own country. And this is not something I knew until I did my research on it, which I found interesting because Denmark has the Viking history, and the Vikings are going to pop up in this video as well later on to the end when we go into the entire UK history. But yeah, it just all kind of ties together, right? So what I also want to mention is Canada, in addition to 14 other countries, so 15 countries in total, are still under the crown, including Canada. This is something I personally didn't even know until maybe 2013 or so, because I had an Australian friend, and Australia is also still under the crown. And my Australian friend, she was living here in New York, but she was actually looking to move to Canada. And I was like, how does that work with work visa? It must be hard and all those things. And she's like, no, actually, it's quite simple for an Australian to get a work visa. And she said that in her fancy Australian accent, which I really can't imitate. She was from Melbourne. She was saying, yeah, it was really easy to get it to Canada because all these countries are still under the crown. And I'm like, what? They're still under the crown? I mean, you know that with Australia and New Zealand, but Canada for me was relatively new. I was like, wow, that is so sad that they're still kind of governed by the Queen somehow. So they still have ties, and I guess they can be considered colonies or former colonies in that way. But yeah, so that is an interesting fact I personally didn't know. What it means is they're not fully sovereign. And same with Australia, New Zealand, and the total of 15 countries. More countries would be Belize, Bahamas, was it Barbados? I think it was a lot of Caribbean countries and nations are still under it. So you could probably look it up online. What I also want to say is that Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, who are all still under the crown, they had the worst lockdown a few years ago, as we remember pretty well. And all those mandates and restrictions, they were pretty bad in those areas. When I was in Australia, because I used to live there in 2019, I actually still remember that, I'm not sure if it was a paper bill or a hard coin. One of those still had the Queen's face on it somehow, and it really was really confusing to me. And all of that has to do with them still somehow being governed by the crown. And if you have a face of a queen floating around on a paper bill or just on a money exchange, that also means, like, on a monetary level, they're not sovereign, which is also very important, right? So let's go through the definition of July before we get into the meaning of the dates. July definition, let me just pull this up right here. So July is named after Julius Caesar. The original name was Quintilis. It's Latin for the 5th month, indicating its position in the early Roman calendar. I believe the 6th month was Sextilis and so on. So Julius Caesar was obviously 2,000 years ago at this point, but it's interesting that July and August is named after Augustus, which is also, he used to be a Roman emperor, that these are still named after these significant Roman governors somehow. And it also comes from the Older English. In Old English, it was literally named Julius, and then it kind of transferred over into July. So this goes back to our entire calendar system having changed. They rewrote our calendar system to the Gregorian one in 1582. That was under Pope Gregor. Before this, we had a completely different system. The New Year was celebrated in March instead of January, which is also why you had fireworks in March and not necessarily in January. That's more of a newer thing. And that was back in the medieval ages. And back under the older system, if you go from like month 1 to 10, that Roman calendar system, we only had 10 months. Our natural cycle is actually 13 months. So women tend to have 13 period cycles throughout the year. There are 13 full moon cycles typically throughout the year. I'm not saying the moon is natural in that way, but I mean, it just kind of shows we were more attuned to natural cycles back in the day. And so them kind of rewriting it to 12 months, also the entire 12 zodiac system. 12 is a number of sacrifice according to a certain numerology. Yeah, it all kind of just loops us into the sacrifice system that we've been under for a few years already, a few decades, a few hundred years, if not a few thousand years, right? And they could have really done us a number by changing the calendar on a natural level and also other levels too. And it's also funny how they kind of reshaped the 24-hour system in a day. You know, it's like usually 12 hours, and then things start over after 12 hours again. But that might be something for a different video. I want to keep this video pretty short. So, short history, there was a war between the colonists and former England, you know, the England that was still reigned by King George in the 1770s. You had the Boston Tea Party, 1772, if I'm not mistaken. Interesting that they knew the exact number of tea bodies. So there were bags and treasure chests that were dumped off the ship. I forgot if it was like 252, 254, but they knew the exact number. And to me, it's almost doubtful that you would know the exact number unless like the numbers is another way, you know, they would want to encode something in us. And of course they do, as we know. So probably another numerology number is thrown at us just with that number in and of itself. I mean, unless they had a very detailed list of, oh, so and so many treasure chests with tea bags were on the ship and so many are there now. I just doubt it's really possible to even know how many were thrown into the ocean by these rebels. In 1774, some founding fathers already wanted freedom, but it was not fully implemented then. And then finally, in June, July 1776, supposedly the Declaration of Independence came into existence. So from June 11th to June 28th, it was drafted, but it was only drafted by 5 of these founding fathers. They were giving us a number of 56 founding fathers. 56 is not a fortunate number, once again, according to a certain numerology. It equals 11. Let me just go into the meaning of 11. 11 symbolizes the clenched hand. 11 is ominous to occultists and is a warning of hidden dangers or treachery from others. This is also considered a master number, powerful and having potent creative ideas. So it has this dualistic nature to it, but overall, it's really not a fortunate number. And master number means something needs to be mastered. So 11, 22, 33, 44, all of those are master numbers, but 11 really isn't extremely fortunate. 22 is can be both fortunate, unfortunate. 33 is definitely more fortunate, just to give you a quick overview of that. So then so that was the short history that's the one your children are learning in schools, by the way, which is, we're not saying it's true, but this is what your children are taught in school. So it is important to know what they're trying to teach these kids, right? This is probably also what you as an American were taught in school. And so there are already like a few things in that narrative that make you wonder what's really going on. Let's just move over to England for one moment. We have King George with his wife, and I actually want to pull up a picture of them. This is King George, and this is Queen Charlotte. They had 15 children, so you can't see them all in this picture. It's a lot, even for them. They were both from the Hanoverian line, which is the Hanover area in Germany. Them being both from the same bloodline also means there's incest involved. So incest was running rampant in European royal lines, possibly still is nowadays, as we know at this point, which is also why you had certain royals with genetic disorders. There was the Spanish king who had a really bad disorder and a lisp and all of that. So King George was known to be the insane king. He was also known to be the king who lost America under his rule. By insane, it's not 100% clear if he was schizophrenic or if he had a bipolar personality disorder or if there was something else. It wasn't just depression or just something that you would consider more of a lenient disorder nowadays. It was full on, because for half of his reign, he was unable to rule. And it's obviously hard to fully diagnose in retrospect, but there are enough documents out there to say he was actually mad or insane, which also means Charlotte was ruling for most of the time. Obviously, her children were taken care of because these are these are royals and they have a million people, at their disposal to take care of them. But if you just imagine she had 15 kids, she was probably pregnant a lot too, and that takes away a lot from the time they're actually able to rule. So it's not really surprising that he lost America under his reign, because it just seemed overall very unfit. What I also want to point out with her, and this might not be of interest to a lot of people, but there are documents out there that say she might have very well been half black and half white, or that she had been like a quarter black and the rest mixed or whatever. In this particular portrait, you can't necessarily see it. There are portraits out there, which you can look up easily online, where she does look like she has some African ancestry in it. And it does make you wonder, did Africans rule the European lines at one point? Or what was really going on? How did that happen? And this was back in the 1770s, or even earlier than that, when they came under the reign. So, I mean, African colonization was, I guess, still going on, or it was kind of at the beginning stages, but I'm not sure it was related to that. So there's a lot of history that's also been muddled up in Europe in and of itself. Okay, so back to King George. What I wanted to point out was here in New York City, which is one of the oldest cities in the US, you still have a few areas which go back to his name. In Upper Manhattan, you have something called Fort Tryon, but right next to it, you have Fort George. And I personally didn't know that this was actually related to him. I always think, okay, maybe it was like George Washington, but no, it actually had to do with King George. And in Brooklyn, you have this busy shopping merchant area called King's Highway. It stretches over quite a few blocks. I think from one end to another, it almost takes an hour to walk, which also leads back to his name. They just left his name out and just renamed it like King's, because there's only one king overall in the US at that point. So interesting facts in one of the oldest cities here in the US. King George came into power after other powerful royal British lines died out. And actually his line in and of itself was not considered to be very powerful according to some historic scriptures. So you had the House of York, and then after that you had the House of Tudor, which York and Tudor are very related. After Queen Elizabeth I, the Tudor regime died out. And then you had the Stuarts. And by the way, I don't like Queen Elizabeth I. I think she was one of the worst queens out there. I'm sure there were worse, but she was pretty bad in my opinion too. So then after that, you had the Stuarts, which also comes back to the entire Scottish bloodline. And they were all at war at one point with each other. And then after that, you had King George. So overall, in the UK, the royal line started when? In the 1000s, early 1100s, and it started because of the Vikings. This is more of a Scandinavian line, which has to do with Denmark and Sweden. I don't really know how to pronounce this name, Ethelstan, or he's also called son of Edward. He was supposedly the first king of UK, what is now known as Great Britain, UK. And this is very interesting because there was this one video, and this is back in 2020, 2021. It was made by this teenager, and you can't find this video online anymore because somehow it was taken down, disappeared from YouTube. But she had this video on how the early presidents of the US all derive from the same ancestry of this particular British royal line. And we're talking about the 1100s. It was made by this girl who had the full family tree. She actually even drew it out, and how they were all related. So you're talking about George Washington, you're talking about the beginning. So a lot of these first presidents, Jefferson, Adams, George Washington, they were the founding fathers. So she drew out the entire family line, how they're related to the British line. So these are the people, the founding fathers here in the US, who determined the date of independence and who supposedly represent the US in the early days. And if you want to go into how certain bloodlines or elite groups or factions control the world, that could be one way, at least on the Western part of it. If they're all related somehow, it does make sense. Now, of course, for almost every single immigrant here in the US, you will have a family tree that somehow derives from Great Britain or Germany or Russia or whatever. But your family tree probably comes more from the working line or the peasants, not necessarily the royal line. So it's a bit hard to connect a royal line for the average American, at least from what I gather. And it's interesting that these founding fathers, or that the first few presidents of the US have that connection to the British royal line after all. So it almost doesn't matter that, you know, they said, oh, bye-bye, King George, we're not under your control anymore, because in a way or another, they're all related to each other, right? It's kind of like just the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, 100th cousin of each other. And if you also look at the images, here's an image of Adams, for example. They all wear wigs back in the day, as we know, but their features all look very similar. And I'm not sure, because you didn't have pictures, you didn't have photographs back then, you only had portraits. I'm not sure if it was the interpretation of the person who drew the portrait, or if it really was a fact that they all just had similar facial features, even similar nose structures. Not all of these founding fathers, but a lot of them, like the 5 that drafted the Declaration of Independence, for sure. So they all look a bit similar. They could very well be related, according to that. It's obviously, you know, we don't have DNA samples or anything, so it's going to be hard to prove nowadays. So from these supposed 56 founding fathers, which we're not even sure all 56 really existed, a lot of them were merchants and trade people, by the way. Only 5 drafted the Declaration of Independence. And one person was the main drafter, which was Thomas Jefferson, also a US president. He then submitted it to Adams and Franklin after drafting it between June 11th to June 28th. Could have been more dates for this country to celebrate independence, by the way, not just in July, because July in and of itself is not very fortunate. It's not a very fortunate month. June is a very lucky month, a very fortunate month, if you really want to go into the energy of a month, how it feels like. But in July in and of itself, it's one of the hottest months, at least here in the original 13 colonies. A lot of heat waves. And what also used to happen a lot, even though it doesn't happen like that every single year, but for sure 2016, 17, 18, 2020 was like the worst. You had eclipse seasons, meaning it has an impact on people's moods. They're extremely moody, angry. It's heating people up. If you believe the statistics, here in New York City, the most criminal month is in July because of that. You know, it's usually during the heat wave days, which is July, early August. So that's just a little something on July that I wanted to add in there. June would have been a bit chillier weather-wise, could have been a bit more fortunate, but they're giving us July, so we have to work with July. And in the last year's video that I made, I had a comment, and this person was saying that she had looked up the biographies of all founding fathers, and most of them seemed made up, or that they were made more glorious than reality could ever show. This could also just mean because maybe only 8 to 5 people really mattered, like those 5 original drafters of the Declaration of Independence, and 8 overall are considered to be the most significant founding fathers. So if you look that up online, you can find the names as well. What I personally found surprising was this one article from a few years ago that a grandchild of one of the first presidents was still alive up until recently. And if we just consider, you know, the entire mud floods, the giant history, people turning much, much older than we're told, you know, people being able to turn a few hundred years old and all of that, perhaps this would be a clue to that. And the elite keeping their lineage alive for much longer than the average person. And we have to ask ourselves through what? Genetic engineering, a machine, perhaps a different video on that too in the future. So considering the entire giant history, you also have this humongous Liberty Bell right here. And this Liberty Bell is in Philadelphia, which belongs to Pennsylvania, one of the original colonies. I personally actually saw it in 2016 in person, and it is quite impressive to look at these things in person. Like, you know, on the spot, it was a huge bell. You can't really see it in this picture, but it is a huge bell. I can tell you that much. And that's the first thing I noticed. You know, I was like, why is this bell so humongous? Like, who's going to ring it? How many people do you need to ring it? Or how much power do you need to ring it? And I mean, this is back in 2016. I wasn't interested in exploring Tartaria, mud floods, or anything at all, but it already made me scratch my head and think about what is really going on. This is so weird. Why do we have this huge bell in the US. There was a huge line to see this bell, by the way. So I think I stood in line for over an hour. And this is a random August date. So when you go there, well, this is before 2020, but I'm pretty sure it's similar nowadays that everything's open. When you go there in the summer months, which is high tourist season because children are off school and parents like to take them for excursions, you will probably stand in line for a very long time. This was a weekend. Maybe you're more lucky during the week. But I had to go to Philly. I was visiting my friend in Philly, and this is like a random August weekend day. I was like, okay, let's just view the Liberty Bell before we visit my friend, and that's what I did. So Philly, DC, very interesting history. One thing that you do see here in the Liberty Bell is it has a crack. And energetically, what does that mean? There's a crack in liberty and freedom. That's kind of how I interpret it. No one really knows why this crack came about. You know, it's a mystery. Like, you can't really find, maybe it's not a mystery to the elite, but officially you can't find much about whether it happened because it was moved around or whether the material was made out of a very poor material in and of itself. So there's a crack in it. And the first time it rang was July 8th. That's one of the dates that I mentioned in the beginning. So let's just kind of look into the numbers and numerology of all of this too. Let me just pull up that one page. Okay, let's just go into the numerology of the 4th, which would be, 4th of July has a 4 numerology. It also has a 7 numerology because it's the month, but it's more about the day, which they're really pushing. So the 4 is, and this is numerology for a person, but you can transfer it easily over onto a date and also different names. The builder and practical person who values details. 4s represent law, order, security, and stability. They prefer conventional routine with a focused state of mind. They develop a practical nature through self-discipline and concentration. On the positive side, they are tenacious and loyal. On the negative side, they are stubborn, confrontational, and a workaholic. 4s are masters of management with a well-built sense of order. So if you just look at the negative side, confrontational and also workaholic, Americans are known to be workaholics, right? And also the entire confrontational part, is this why America is always at war with other countries and at war with each other in its own country? Different cultures, ethnicities, races, political sides, political parties. So there's always like this war that's being fought. You had the Civil War, you had the wars between different political parties. Obviously, you had so many wars. So it really does make you wonder. 4 is also a very karmic number, and it's probably re-emphasizing the karma that this land carries, because the land obviously carries energy in and of itself. So if we go to the number 2, the partner and diplomat who values cooperativeness, that already sounds like a much fortunate number, right? 2s represent a pair or a duo, the principle of receptivity and tactfulness. Not something you would necessarily say about the US. They prefer to be a follower, though they seek inner balance and unity. 2s seek unity between 2 distinct entities like good and evil, true or false, positive and negative. They are cautious but flexible. On the positive side, they are creative and sensitive. On the negative side, they are moody, shy, and irrational. 2s are modest with a desire for collaboration. So collaboration is a huge one for 2. Who thought July 2nd was the best date, or was the actual date that it was celebrated? Adams. He was one of the founding fathers, one of the drafters, and one of the early presidents too. So Adams insisted up until the day he died, which he actually died on July 4th. And I believe Jefferson was another one who died on that day. Not the exact same year. They died years apart, obviously. But he was one of those people who thought July 2nd would be the day that would go into history as Independence Day. And therefore, you can basically say there's this huge portal opening up. And by portal, I mean this opportunity. So you have this entire month from July 2nd to August 2nd, which August 2nd, it could have been the date too. But August in and of itself has a completely different numerology as well. But the number 2 is obviously in it. So it would have still had that element of collaboration in it. So basically, Adams, up until the day he died, he insisted that, oh, people are going to have fireworks or illuminations, how they were called back then, from one end of the continent to the next on this day. And it's going to be pomp and parade and parties and all of the good things. But no, it ended up being July 4th. And you really have to wonder why. What are they trying to take away from us? And only having one day to celebrate freedom is pretty meager and similar to having a breadcrumbs thrown at you, right? Whereas you can have this entire month ahead where you can celebrate your own sovereignty, your own freedom, and your own liberty, by the way. What I also want to point out that the entire July 4th and it maybe being cursed, I mean, at least two of the founding fathers died during that day. You also have, possibly the numerology that we just discussed with confrontation and being at war with each other. And then you also have the White House element to it, where when you just see people, no matter what president it is at this point, if you just see people entering it and getting out of that 4 years later or 8 years later, depending on their term, they look very much aged, right? So it makes you wonder how many entities are floating around that White House, and is it like a time machine that makes people age more, or like all these various things that go into one and the same thing almost. So you have the 13 original colonies. Connecticut is a constitution state, and I personally always wanted to celebrate in Connecticut for 4th of July. One day I will make that dream a reality. But yeah, it must be a different feeling just to kind of celebrate it in the actual constitution state. Delaware is said to be the first state, and then you have all the other states, the original 13 colonies, where I personally think energetically you would feel it in those 13 original colonies the most, because this is where it all came about. Okay, let me look at some notes just to wrap this up. So I think that was pretty much all I wanted to say in regards to that. You had Hawaii and a few other states, which are also added on a 4th of July, but that was more after World War II. Hancock was the first one. So let's just go back to the actual Declaration of Independence. Was that all? We had a flag. We had this here. Yeah, Hancock was the first one. He did not end up being any of the original drafters, from my understanding, but he was the one who signed it the largest, which they're saying it was so that the king would be able to read it even if he were blind, but maybe it was because they had giant hands. Who knows? I mean, if you look up Hancock, he appears to be a regular merchant according to the mainstream narrative. So he's not someone who ever became a president or anything like that. So I think we kind of rehashed that the Independence Day in and of itself wasn't federally recognized up until the 1870s, which would be right on par with the entire mud flood history, our history being erased and then rewritten again. Yeah, and I think that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. So I hope this helped you in a form or another. And let me know what you think, whether or not you're celebrating or you really care about it. I personally do think you can definitely do a lot with this entire window of opportunity that's opening up. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Enjoy. Bye, guys.